Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
I'm Robbie Hurlocker, and today we're joined by a special guest. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Devon Green.
It's great to have you at the table today.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Speaking of the table, the issue on the table today is Cabinet Battle number 2.
Woohoo! There is so much information in this song. I'm just going to lay it out there now. There is a lot going on here.
We're going to be starting a new podcast called the Cabinet Battle number 2 podcast.
It's going to go on for a really long time.
Yeah. We have a lot to talk about, so.
That's why we brought in a pinch hitter today. So, Devon, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am a anthropologist / history buff and a super nerd. So, that's my cred. And I am on a local podcast called Okie Geek, where we explore all manner of geekiness, especially local geekiness. And I kind of fell in this wormhole before Hamilton, having read a book called Child of Terror by Susan Nagel. And it is about the daughter of Marie Antoinette. And I can't even tell you why I picked it up, except I was just interested to see what happened to Marie Antoinette's daughter, Marie Therese. And it launched me down this rabbit hole of, you really don't know anything about the French Revolution or why it happened or how it happened and what happened. And and the end result being here. So, yeah.
Yeah, we ran into you. Vinton and I were visiting one of the gaming cons here in Oklahoma City.
SuperBitCon, which was so fun.
It was a lot of fun. And we ran into you as we were walking in the building. We hadn't even gotten there yet. And you started talking to us about our podcast that you were listening to. And you told us about that book. And I'm only on chapter 5 of that particular book right now. And I do have to say, it is amazing, and you're absolutely right. Thank you for recommending it.
You are so welcome.
It is giving me a new appreciation for Marie Antoinette and everything she went through, and King Louis XVI. They have a great. She has a great treatment of their particular royal family in that book so far, and I'm excited to finish it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book, and it paints such a more lucid portrait of them as human beings, as opposed to these icons that they were held up as in the press yeah, it's a fantastic book, and I highly recommend it. I have actually gone back and read it again since, because it is so, you can mine it for such good information about some of the key players in the French Revolution, at least at the start. Pretty much everybody dies. Spoilers.
Oh no.
But no, I mean
that's true.
It's called the Reign of Terror for a reason, so that's why I'm here.
Oh, it's great.
Hoping I didn't skip any major portions.
So, Vinton, you want to kick us off talking about this a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll describe what's going to be happening in the song through the lyrics real quick. The issue on the table, France is on the verge of war with England, and do we provide aid in our troops to our French allies, or do we stay out of it? And Jefferson and Hamilton are going to be arguing this point. Now, Jefferson actually believed in history that Hamilton had already won over Washington, and this whole meeting was pointless.
Yeah, that's right. So when they actually met together to have this cabinet battle, it was very clear that all of the notes for this meeting were drafted by Hamilton himself.
Right.
And so he actually wrote the agenda for the meeting. He wrote the talking points, and then Washington, in kind of a shady move, he rewrote them in his own penmanship to make it not look like Hamilton had drafted them.
Which Jefferson called out in some of his writings. He wrote about that. He was like, okay, this isn't Washington's hand, but it's clearly Hamilton's words.
Right.
Which, I mean, really is just going to lead us right into the next song, Washington on Your Side.
Exactly.
Knowing that bit of historical fact.
It's true. Another little tidbit of information here is that in order to draw the lines between Jefferson and Hamilton a little more clearly because this is the one song where we really get to dive into the French Revolution conflict in the musical itself. So that is a big deal in history, but in this musical, it's not the biggest conflict. So here, in order to paint that conflict a little more clearly, Lin-Manuel Miranda actually paints Jefferson as the person that wants to commit American troops to the conflict. But both Hamilton and Jefferson historically did favor neutrality in the sense of American troops being involved. Both of them saw that America was a little too weak after our conflict to really raise an army to send over to France to fight for them at that point. But so he kind of combines a few different things in here to make the conflict a little bit more stark. But it was very clear in history that Jefferson is the Francophile supporting the French Revolution, and Hamilton was very much opposed to what became a very bloody, violent, disorderly revolution in the end. And so in this cabinet battle, we're going to see that conflict played out a little bit.
I think what's also interesting is Jefferson's rivalry with Hamilton informing his position on this. Besides the fact that Jefferson is an idealist and a romantic about the whole idea of revolution and freedom,
Right.
he's also diametrically opposed to anything Hamilton, accusing him of being an Anglophile, accusing him of reneging on his promises, just painting a really bad portrait of Hamilton because he was opposed to Hamilton.
Right.
And then also Jefferson is, from my research, I get the impression that he was a little cocky about us having started the ball rolling as far as revolutions go, and him really, yes, the American Revolution in some ways did directly inform the French Revolution.
Right.
But Jefferson would have you believe that we started this party and you have us to thank, and
right.
It's all our deal. And so in sympathy with that, he feels like it's almost our obligation to go back them up because we got this whole romantic freedom thing started. And it seems that Jefferson is not terribly concerned with the logistics. He is more concerned with the ideas.
Right. He's definitely the idealist here, and Hamilton's the realist, saying we can't commit to this. Yeah. And he makes a lot of really strong arguments for why we shouldn't have to commit to this, even though we do have a treaty with our French allies from back in the Revolutionary War era. So yeah, the whole question is that treaty even valid now?
Right.
Yeah. And how should America maintain neutrality in this conflict without violating our treaties if they're still valid? So those are the things on the table. The other issue on the table in the actual cabinet meeting historically was whether or not to receive a French ambassador, because that would be essentially acknowledging that the French government that existed after executing King Louis XVI, it would be validating that government that's in place there.
Yeah.
And it would say, we're accepting an ambassador from you, we're receiving you, and so we acknowledge that. And in Hamilton's mind, in order to receive that ambassador, we have to acknowledge that the treaties are still valid, that they're a valid nation, that they have a right to claim the validity of everything that we've ever agreed to with France. And Jefferson was very much in favor of accepting the French ambassador, Citizen Genet, and he basically said that, here's an actual quote, "We cannot deny to other nations that principle whereon our government is founded." And he said that every nation has a right to change these forms of government of its own will, and externally to transact business with other nations through whatever organ it chooses, whether it be a king, a convention, assembly, committee, president, or whatever it may be. The only essential thing is the will of the nation. So in this song, Jefferson will say, the people are leading. The people have chosen what's going on here, and so we need to acknowledge the will of the French people, and that's what matters, that keeps our French treaties valid. And Hamilton will say that, no, we signed a treaty with King Louis XVI. He was the one who was invested in this situation. He was trying to stick it to Great Britain, and he couldn't afford a war of his own there, and so he was like, let's just finance the war in America to get to Great Britain in that regard. And so Hamilton's like, this is a new government. It's not the one that we actually agreed to these terms with to begin with.
Yeah, we signed the treaty with the king whose head is now in a basket.
Right?
I love that.
Yeah,
and the line that follows.
Yeah. And then the musical, Lin-Manuel pretends to be picking a head out of a basket and looking at it, and then he holds his own head and gives the answer.
Yeah.
Oh, man, that pantomime.
So
I'm super dead.
super sassy.
Dead. Yeah. So this is such a quagmire.
It really is. I don't know where to begin discussing this, because I want to talk about everything that's happening in France. I want to talk about everything in America. I want to go through the lyrics.
And there is so much.
There really is.
That's the thing. This little period of 1792 to 1793 is such a crucial point. And so much happens, including lots of people changing their mind about things.
Oh, yes.
And that's part of the quagmire that is this precipice of history. So, but Jefferson sees this as the opportunity for freedom, y'all. And he feels obligated to support the ideals. And there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So do we want to just dive in?
Yeah. So in the lyrics, Jefferson makes the case, we needed money and guns and half a chance. Who provided those funds? And Madison Jefferson, France.
Yeah, I love that.
Monotone, speaking. And in history, Madison was often called to speak publicly, but he had a weak voice and had no confidence in his public speaking skills. And this might actually be calling to that a little bit.
Right. Well, it's also such a stark contrast because this is Oak, the guy that played Hercules Mulligan in Act 1. So like he's so hyped up in Act 1. He's like, brah, brah, come on, guys, let's get excited about the war. And then he's like, France.
Yeah.
France. Yeah.
A little bit of a
Deadpan.
callback to Jefferson and What Did I Miss? When he said, improv that line, like we mentioned, France.
Yep. Yeah, you see the camaraderie of Jefferson and Madison here where they're very much on the same page. They're finishing each other's sentences. They are very much answering each other's questions. They are united against Hamilton, who, if it weren't for Washington being on his side, would be a force alone and would not have anyone backing him up.
Right. So Jefferson also says, in return, they didn't ask for land. Distorted fact a little bit there.
Yeah.
Right?
They actually did want to maintain some of their property in North America. Specifically, where were they located?
What they didn't do was ask for the colonies to give up land that the colonies already owned.
Right.
But they did ask for some islands and for control for extensive land in French Louisiana.
Yep. Fun fact, they got Tobago and Senegal
Oh, nice.
in the treaty. And in my research, I found that the king, it was a tacit agreement that he would sign off if they were allowed to maintain control of their North American. So they weren't technically letter of the law. They didn't ask for land.
Okay.
But there was a tacit agreement that they would be able to maintain control of their land in North America. And then they got Tobago and Senegal
Right.
as spoils of war, or door prize, if you will,
Yeah.
for showing up. Yeah.
And speaking of who owns the land and the land being in the U.S. and everything, so my understanding of the original treaty was that it really only pledged the U.S. to defend North American lands belonging to the Crown of France. But Jefferson here is arguing that we go over there to the European and fight with them over there.
Yeah, I really think Jefferson, like we were saying, is such an idealist and also feels a sense of responsibility of starting this whole revolutionary thing, that his ideals and his distorted sense of responsibility because of those ideals and cockiness. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I interpreted that treaty as well. Like, we agreed to defend, like, you get in a fight, we'll back you up, was the extent of the treaty, broad strokes. But Jefferson is using it as a launch pad for, like, we should go help fight their fight because they're fighting for freedom, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah.
Which, I mean, historically, while Jefferson might not have been pushing for the U.S. to necessarily fully get involved, like Robbie mentioned earlier, he was actually just for revolution in general, saying the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants.
It's harsh, dude. Like, just talking
It's
about...
pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. It was one of a dear friend of mine's favorite Jefferson quotes. And I was like, that's super brutal, dude.
Right.
Like,
It's the one that I've heard probably more frequently than anything else, maybe except for his plagiarized lines in the Declaration. That line comes up all the time. And it's usually to justify whatever conflict you're trying to push
Yes.
with your political agenda at the time.
Right.
every time.
Quick note on the lyrics just after that. He ends a line with stand and begins it with stand again, which he also does in Cabinet Battle number 1. That line, and it's too many damn pages for any man to understand. Stand with me in the land of the free.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So to me, that kind of points toward, he mentions stand a lot here, and it's that reason that Hamilton's going to actually side with Jefferson over Burr later in the musical. Jefferson's willing to take a stand. He's all about standing for something, and Burr's not. So I think that's worth mentioning real quick.
Yeah.
As it comes up in the lyrics
That's
there.
a really good point, because, yes.
Yeah, and the accusation that Hamilton always levels against Burr is, if you stand for nothing, Burr, what'll you fall for?
Because Jefferson is directly standing against Hamilton each time he mentions stand.
Right.
But he's making a stand for something, and Hamilton respects that.
Yes, and that makes a lot of sense. Alexander Hamilton respects someone for making a stand and actually opposing him in that. I like that line that comes right after that, where he talks about standing with their brothers as they fight against tyranny. He says, I know that Alexander Hamilton as tyranny would rather not have this debate. So first, that internal rhyme of tyranny and hearanty
Perfect.
is so beautiful.
So beautiful.
So characteristically.
And delivered so well.
Oh, yeah, so perfectly delivered. Daveed Diggs is wonderful, and I will never stop singing his praises.
Right?
They're so good. Historically, Hamilton and Jefferson did often come into this battle where they were... Jefferson was like, hey, I'm the Secretary of State. I'm supposed to be the one negotiating with foreign dignitaries and all of that. And Hamilton frequently would kind of infringe on Jefferson's turf a little bit, because the realm of Treasury and the realm of the State Department were not necessarily as clearly defined as they are today. So often, in order to keep the Treasury going, you'd have to have some type of trade going. And so since Hamilton's plan was to have British trade involved, he wanted to meet with the British ambassadors. He was often going behind Jefferson's back to meet with the British representatives, which is often a good thing, because Jefferson was so hateful towards those representatives that nothing could have gotten done for a long time. And so sometimes the British ambassadors would just actively go to Hamilton because they knew they had a friend in him. And so they would look at him, and Hamilton would often end up like butting up against Jefferson's turf, which would make him super, super mad.
Yeah, and Lynn's historical context, I'll remind you that he is not Secretary of State.
Yep. And then the next line, he knows nothing of loyalty.
Well, technically not true. He knew a lot of loyalty to Washington, to Lawrence, and to America.
And to Lafayette.
And to Lafayette.
Yeah,
but not so much Eliza.
No. And I think that's an interesting...
There might be a call out there.
I was going to say, I read that as a call out to that, but you can't make a case where he wasn't politically, idealistically loyal. Like, he was incredibly loyal. And this comes up in my homework. One of the major points here is Hamilton was the one steadily trying to pay back France for the enormous and crushing debt that they had gone into to help win our revolution.
Yes.
So if only that piece of evidence, like, he knows where his loyalties lie and he knows where his sense of obligation is. And then as well, I don't know if we want to get into this now, but
we can jump around.
Into it. We're going to talk about Lafayette, because that's one of the little call outs that Jefferson is. What about our loyalty to Lafayette?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hamilton was incredibly loyal to Lafayette to the point where he let his son come live with him.
Yep.
Yes.
George Washington
Lafayette. Yeah, exactly. And
we all love that name. We're all jumping in the same.
Right? It's so good. And it really speaks to, I know you guys addressed this on the last episode, it really speaks to Lafayette's deep and abiding love of the American people, of the American Revolution, his commitment. But Hamilton recognizes that, and through every textual analysis I've done, there is nothing to argue that he didn't know things about loyalty, especially to Lafayette.
And it's really interesting when this gets brought up in the musical at the end of the song here, because you have Jefferson, who played Lafayette, basically calling him out. What about me, basically? And as you remember in the musical, it was in Yorktown. Hamilton himself promised Lafayette, we'll be there to help you.
Directly, yeah.
Yes. So
there's this meta.
Yeah, in the context of this actual musical, I often want to just shout liar to him whenever I'm listening to that song. He's like, hey, we'll be there to help you when that happens. I'm like, oh man, that's so disappointing. But historically...
I've heard Battle number 2.
Right. So the French Revolution, I mean, let's just go here for a second since we're already on the topic. Lafayette didn't fare well in the French Revolution at all.
Terribly.
Like, so he...
I mean, to be fair, he survived.
He survived.
but no one in his entire family did except for his son.
Yeah, it was his in-laws, his family. He was imprisoned for a long time. He was left prison, emaciated, and so when the Declaration of the Rights of Man was published, he was basically one of the key writers with Jefferson, and he at that point became in charge of the newly formed National Guard. And so the Marquis de Lafayette, as a traditionally American hero, was now at the head of this French National Guard, and he was a huge proponent for the constitutional monarchy. So, since he's so involved in the American cause, we often forget that he actually supported King Louis XVI when it came to him maintaining his seat as a king. He just didn't want to have that be a absolute monarchy. He wanted to have a constitutional monarchy that kind of played into that. So, consistently, he supported the ideals of, like he said, American democracy works for America. In France, we need to have a more nuanced approach. He's more of the constitutional monarchist there. And so when the revolutionary people are uprising in France, they cut off the head of King Louis XVI, and they basically start attacking the Marquis de Lafayette. They run him out of the country, and he spends the next several years in prisons. And if it weren't for him being abroad and in prison, then he probably would have been killed as well. So when Jefferson looks at Hamilton and says, "Did you forget Lafayette?" It's not even a fair argument, because Lafayette was not someone that would benefit from the French Revolution being supported here. Lafayette was actually very much hurt by the revolution and how bloody it was and how disorganized it was and how remember, a lot of the people that actually came over to help Americans and the people that were the French officers who came over to fight with us, even the Count de Rochambeau was very much hurt by the French Revolution because they were seen as the aristocrats who were closely connected to the monarchy, and the people who were the king sent over here to fight with us, they were the ones that had that power, and the people with power were the ones that were overturned in the French Revolution. So a lot of this, if you take the Republican side, the Jeffersonian camp on this particular French Revolution, they have this idealized version of the French. They say, well, the French are the ones that just came over here and they were our friends. They fought with us. But really, the Hamiltonians had this more nuanced idea saying, well, the ones that actually came over here are being overthrown. Yeah. The king that we signed the treaty with. Right now. Yeah, those are the ones that are hurting. And so there's a really big back and forth. It was a hugely debated thing in America because you would see people actually introducing each other as, greeting each other as citizen in America, or Jacobins, or like talking about how they wanted to be, they were defining American politics by the idealized version of what the French Revolution was. And so, yeah, it's very reductionistic to say that the Marquis de Lafayette was actually hurt by this, or that Hamilton stopped thinking about him. He was very much a friend of the Lafayette family, beginning to end.
And I think it's worth noting, because I always want to point out awesome things Angelica did in history.
Yeah.
While Hamilton may not have helped Lafayette much in this situation, Angelica did. She was a constant advocate for him and his friends, and enlisted the help of Washington and Jefferson in saving Lafayette from the Reign of Terror.
Big ups. Yeah, I discovered that as well, and was like, well played.
Yeah.
Well played.
It just goes to show that, like, founding mothers, guys, they're a thing. Read about them.
They run stuff.
Yeah. Yes. Find out how great they were, because they did some awesome things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pick up the Cokie Robert books. They're fantastic. Did you guys catch, and I happened to pass this while I was pulling up Genius earlier just to look at the lyrics as we were going through this. Lin-Manuel tweeted a couple series of tweets about some deleted lines.
Yeah.
So, like, he has this little punch that mentions Angelica Schuyler that was originally in Cabinet Battle number 2. He says, Jefferson, looking at Hamilton in the end, he says, hey, can you do me a favor? Depends, I can try. Can you tell Angelica Schuyler I said hi? And Hamilton, she's never mentioned you, Jeff. She's not the type who shares, but since you're so interested in foreign affairs. Oh, snap.
I discovered that this morning, and I was like, oh, that's so good.
Yeah. It is, and it definitely distracts from the initial conflict here. Right. It makes it a lot more personal, though.
Yeah.
And it is very much a personal moment. So I could have taken it or left it, but it was something that I think is, oh man, that moment.
I mean, we've mentioned before Jefferson's quote unquote relationship with Angelica, as in, you know, him wanting to talk to her and flirt with her, but her turning him down left and right.
Yeah, basically.
Yep.
So where were we? No, nothing of loyalty.
So going back to where we were in the lyrics, Jefferson basically calls out Hamilton saying that he dresses like fake royalty, which is interesting here because Jefferson on the stage is the one dressed in like bright purple and fancy clothes. And the audience will get a laugh there because it's very hypocritical if you're watching it happen.
Yeah, he's not very self-aware in this moment at all. There's actually a quote from, I think it was a Senator, William McClay, who was talking about Secretary Jefferson at the time. And he says, he has an air of stiffness in his manner. His clothes seem too small for him. He sits in a lounging manner on one hip commonly, and with one of his shoulders elevated much above the other. His face has a cranny aspect. And, like, he talks and he keeps going on. His whole figure has a loose, shackling air. So Jefferson historically was attacked for his own apparel and the way he dressed and how lazy he was in his own apparel, even though he was the one who had the plantation life. He was just the kind of lazy politician who kind of strolled in there, didn't really care too much about his apparel. But here he very much is attacking Hamilton as that new money guy, the person who is like a royalty.
As you might remember, we've mentioned before, Hamilton did live with Hercules Mulligan, who was a tailor. So I'm sure he got some nice clothes from that time of his life.
Oh, yeah.
And Chernow actually describes Hamilton as a dashing figure, trim and stylish, though not showy in dress, which can't necessarily be said for Jefferson, at least in the musical. So Jefferson then calls him out even further, really harshly here, desperate to rise above his station, which we know he is from the musical. That's a common theme.
Oh, yeah.
Then everything he does betrays the ideals of our nation. Jefferson, do you know the ideals of our nation?
Right?
Because I think Hamilton represents them pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt like that was a particularly brutal line, like directed at Hamilton, and so incredible, like proof of Jefferson's out of touch And also of his dislike of Hamilton outruling what's best for the country, really. Like, I feel like that's a telling line of...
The only way that makes sense is if you use betray in such a way to say exposes or shows.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, yeah, perfectly.
Yeah, but that's definitely not what he means here,
no,
though.
Not at all.
Yeah, you're right. The American dream, as we call it, is to be able to make something out of nothing, to be able to rise up above your station, to come into the world with nothing, work harder and achieve and make something out of your life. That is what we call the American dream.
Absolutely.
And that's what Jefferson is attacking him for, saying, hey, he's new money. He just married into this stuff. He's dressing like fake royalty now, and he has his place of power. He's desperate to rise above his station. Well, yeah, that's American.
Yeah. That's kind of what we're all here for, bud.
Then the final line for Jefferson's side of this is the, hey, and if you don't know, well, now you know, Mr. President.
Yeah. Nice reference there to Notorious B.I.G. and his song Juicy.
Yeah.
Which that line is repeated often in.
Yeah, when Daveed Diggs was doing it, I think it was in a Hamilton where I saw this note where he said that it's very difficult for him to finish this phrase without dropping the N-word because he's so used to rapping the Notorious B.I.G. lyrics that he's like, it's just muscle memory. I'm fighting it here. I'm trying to make sure I don't say the words from the actual rap. I'm trying to make sure I stay with
Mr. President.
Right. It would.
There's like a hesitation. Mr. President? Okay, got it. All right, I'm in the clear.
I definitely don't think that dropping the N-word would have been a good way to get Washington on his side.
Absolutely agree with that.
So Hamilton comes in at this point in the musical, and he comes in heavy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he does.
Drops the hammer.
Yes. So at the very, in the first cabinet battle when Hamilton starts, he's almost a little bit, sassy, and he's prepared, but he's all composed, and he's like, when he comes into the first battle, he's like, Thomas, that was a real nice declaration. Welcome to the present. You're running a real nation. So he's at least composed in himself here. In this cabinet battle number 2, he says, you must be out of your gosh darn mind, if you think. And then he finally
not
gets
gosh
on.
Darn, but yes.
Yeah, you're right.
We're not going to say that on this podcast.
We don't have
fun here.
Exactly. So he just is totally upset. He's flustered. He hates the personal attacks being leveled against him. There's almost nothing that can set Hamilton ablaze more than attacking his character. Mm-hmm. He absolutely goes to bat. Every single time his public character is attacked, he gets angry. He goes to the press. He writes a paper. He opens his mouth, speaks words, and gives his enemies free ammunition. And he is the one who just is so angry here. He comes out swinging, and he thinks, there's no way you're making any type of sense in this moment, Jefferson. So his barrage of information here is just so good.
And just to quickly retouch on Hamilton's position now that he's jumping in, we've kind of already touched on this a little bit. Mm-hmm. Jumping into another revolution would not be easy for America. We're already picking ourselves back up from our last one. And his argument here is that France was primarily in this revolution because France had acted aggressively to start the war. It didn't violate the defense treaty that they already signed. So here he's kind of bringing that up. And I love the way he does it in the lyrics here of meddling in the middle of a military mess, which is very similar to that big pun lyric from Twins. Robbie, I'll let you do it.
Oh yeah, I hadn't even thought of that until you mentioned that today, because I hadn't connected those two lines.
Yeah.
But I love big pun, and it's the line, "Dead in the middle of little did we know that we riddled some middlemen who didn't do diddly." Big pun is a big influence in this musical and in Lin-Manuel's life. I love it.
Yeah, everyone, you're welcome for me letting Robbie do that instead of me trying to do it. It would not have sounded this pretty.
No, I just love the alliteration in that as well, with the meddling in the middle of a military mess. It's so good.
It is beautiful.
And you get another chess reference, a game of chess where France is queen and kingless.
If
That's
you
a
don't,
bad game of chess.
Yeah, if you don't have your king, the game's over.
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
You're done already from the start.
Right. Which is Hamilton's argument, saying that the king is gone, the game is over, we don't need to respect that treaty anymore, it is done.
And we already mentioned him pulling the head out of the basket and asking it, and King Louis' head saying, do whatever you want, I'm super dead. Which actually, Lin-Manuel Miranda pointed out, this is really funny to me, is a complete reference to My Brother and Me with the McElroy brothers who do the Adventure Zone, because I guess that's something that comes up pretty often. But he's like, yeah, this is, on Twitter, he said, this is arguably Mabim Bam, as it's known, homage. It's definitely informed by hours of me listening to Griffin McElroy. Which I think it's really funny that he put that joke in there from a podcast that he really likes listening to.
Right? Yeah, I found that out this morning too, and I was like, that's fantastic.
I read that Lin-Manuel Miranda actually originally had Hamilton's verse continue a lot further than this, where he was like, he originally had a lot more that Hamilton would say and a lot of arguments that he would stack on top of this, but he thought that line was so poignant and so appropriate that he was like, I'm going to cut it there, let Washington finish the arguments. Washington just comes in and says, Hamilton is right. That's enough. You don't need to say any more. I'm convinced. So remember, Washington's style of leadership is often, he's not going to create the new ideas, the grand ideas on his own. He's going to compile all of the ideas himself and then use his legendary judgment that he often has, that he's at least known for, and he'll pick and choose which he thinks is the best actual solution. So he says, look, Hamilton's right. We're too fragile to start another fight. And so having Washington pick up on the argument is the perfect transition, Lin-Manuel said, into the next song where it's Washington is on his side. That's why Jefferson thinks Hamilton is winning. He thinks that, you know what, when Hamilton and Washington are together, it's not even a fair fight. Why did I even show up? What am I doing here? He's so frustrated that now he has no voice, and everything he believes in, because remember, he's such an ideological thinker, everything he believes in is being attacked. And so this is something that really does kind of springboard him into these types of fights in the Washington administration are kind of the things that start springboarding Jefferson into wanting out of at least this administration's politics. And there are a number of things that bring him there, and we'll talk about that in the next episode when we get into Washington on your side. But here he's seen a lot of the stress, a lot of the conflict. Washington comes in, backing Hamilton up, and Jefferson is flustered and angry about it.
Yeah, and I mean, Chernow mentions about Washington. Washington ends both of these and comes in and picks the right person. There's usually one person giving kind of the political smart argument, and the other one comes in emotional, and Washington ends it and then says, hey, I can, look past the bickering and find who's correct here. And Chernow said, if Washington lacked the first-rate intellect of Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, and Adams, he was gifted with superb judgment. When presented with the options, he almost invariably chose the right one.
Jefferson would have disagreed.
Well, yes.
Very true.
Yeah.
But we respect Chernow here more than Jefferson.
All the time.
Uh-oh.
Truth.
So, as I'm reading, one of the books I really have loved in my research is Jefferson and Hamilton, The Rivalry That Forged a Nation by John Ferling. But as he goes through that book, he's presenting Jefferson and he's presenting Hamilton, and he tries so hard to be fair to both of them that there are moments where, as he talks about Jefferson, it's almost like he's trying to present something fair and nice and kind, and he's trying to say Jefferson's perspective is this, and he's trying to be more benevolent, and he's trying to be kind about it. And as I'm reading, I'm like, just come out and say it, Ferling. Just come out and say that he's being a jerk.
Yeah, because if you take the super dry interpretations, even on the Monticello website, you still come away with that conclusion that he was kind of a jerk, especially when he was impassioned about something. I get the impression too is that he was way willing to let his ideals carry him rather than he would rather come to the idealistic conclusion and rather than the pragmatic one, which leads us to one of my favorite parts of the cabinet battle right here is that we're too fragile to start another fight. And Jefferson, but do we not fight for freedom? Which, again, that's Jefferson being idealistic.
Right.
And this is about freedom, y'all. Washington, sure, when the French figure out who's going to lead him. Jefferson, the people are leading. And this is my favorite part. The people are rioting. There's a difference. And that, to me, sums up that is a perfect nutshell of what is going on in France right now, is that no one is really leading this bullet train to crazy town.
Yeah.
And people are jumping off left and right because they're realizing it's a bullet train to crazy town and that no one is really, frankly, in charge.
Right. And so when Washington, when Washington calls him out and says, frankly, it's a little disquieting that you would let your ideals blind you to reality. So let's just dive in. What else is happening in France? We've talked about how it's just disorderly and bloody and all of that, but what else is it that's happening?
Okay. A lot.
In a 90-second nutshell, a soundbite.
But basically,
just kidding.
There is a gaping chasm between the ruling class and the poor.
Right.
In the middle of those are very wealthy merchants that are not nobility, relatively and then poor nobility. So they're kind of the people left, in the middle. And then there's the crushing poor because of an amalgam of factors, but mainly trade, transport of goods. They're it's the ultimate keep it local experience, to the point of poverty because trade routes within France are so difficult and unnavigable that it is almost impossible for regions to specialize like we see now. So we have everything being produced locally and thereby shortages, etc. So that's going on. And then we also have this crushing poverty that's a direct result of that. Crushing debt as a result of them being involved in the American Revolution. And also the old regime doddering along and still acting like they're a superpower, which they're not.
Right.
In addition to that, a weak France is what's keeping all of Europe kind of stable. And so everyone else has an investment. This is all stuff I've learned this week.
Oh, really?
A weak
it's so good, though.
A weak France is kind of the little fulcrum that the whole of Europe is balancing on. And so everyone has an investment in keeping France exactly the way it is. And no one wants to disrupt that status quo, even though that status quo it is crushing the poor. But everyone else has an investment.
Is not quo.
Yeah, it's not at all. But everyone has an investment in keeping it that way because a powerful France would disrupt the whole of Europe. And then, but a weak France is just keeping it right at that level of peace.
Yeah. And it is, remember, a lot of the European nobility is related to each other and they're like very interconnected. The royal families from Great Britain are like actively involved in the coronations of France and like at the baptisms of each other's children and all these things. Like there are a lot of family members who are involved. Like when King Louis XVI has a couple sons and daughters at the time, people are like, oh, great. Now you have a couple potential heirs and you have gifts that you can bestow upon other noble families in the countries around you. And so they like look at women as the gifts and prizes to be won or whatever. So ridiculous. But yeah, you have these noble families that are super, super connected. So if one family falls, then they all fall. And at the same time, or not they all fall, but there's so much political connections and interweavings that it is a very fragile situation and it is a very personal situation.
Yes.
For the royal side of things. That a lot of people are so opposed to royalty and nobility as a rule that they can't get around the ideas that people like Marquis de Lafayette had of saying that, well, we can keep the nobility around, we can keep the royalty around, while still being true to our Constitution, being true to our rights that all people and all men should have in our countries. They didn't see that a lot of these people were the idealists who thought that if you are standing up for the king living, then you are opposing the poor being able to eat and being able to have food. And so there's a lot of ideologies that are clashing. There are a lot of personal conflicts that are overlapping with each other. And there are a lot of things being thrown around the press where lots of things are being misinterpreted and reinterpreted and lots of lies going around and propaganda being promoted. Like, actually, one of the things, and we won't put a link to this in the show notes because it's really inappropriate, but
it is.
When the Marquis de Lafayette came to and was in France during the revolution, like at the beginning of the revolutionary time, he was looking around and he visited Marie Antoinette for a little while, and in some propaganda pamphlets against him, they had these pornographic pictures that had been drawn up and sketched up of Marquis de Lafayette and Marie Antoinette together doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. And so there's like rumors of an affair, rumors of things. They were trying to discredit the Lafayette family and the legacy. They were trying to attack Marie Antoinette and all of her things. And they were so opposed to these people who had positions of prominence, positions of power, that there was almost like free game, that they were willing to attack anyone who had power so that the people who didn't have it could get it. So it was very much riots, very much a lot of just people overthrowing whatever they could overthrow.
And interestingly enough, I learned this little tidbit. Freedom of the press was a relatively new thing.
Yeah.
And right around this exact time that you're talking about, the pornographic attacks, especially of Marie Antoinette. And fun side note, the French people never truly trusted Marie Antoinette because she was a foreigner.
Right.
And so, and in my research, I found that the public looking for any in to attack and discredit Marie Antoinette, the press had kind of been holding on to these awful, awful things to say about her until they got, and there hadn't been freedom of the press, then all of a sudden there was. So there's like a decade worth of horrible things to say, just like in an info dump. Yes. Yeah. And it's terrible. Mm-hmm. And, you know, what it does to her reputation, what it does to Lafayette's reputation. But they'd been holding this in for like so it's on top of all of this unrest that's happening. There's been a decade worth of, more than that actually, resentment towards this foreign queen who they feel is dramatically out of touch. But yeah, like all dumped on the public at once to help stir these feelings of, we don't need a monarchy anymore. We can run ourselves.
Right. And so when, as a constitutional monarchist, when Lafayette was over there trying to defend that as the only form of government that can guarantee liberty in France, he was often attacked on all sides. He valued himself as a true moderate. He thought of himself, and there's a cool quote I saw where he was talking about, I read this in the Marquis Lafayette Reconsidered by Laura Aurichurio. I'm sorry for mispronouncing her name, but so in the introduction she has this quote where he says that he insists that true moderation consists, not as many people seem to think, in always seeking the middle between any 2 points, but in trying to recognize the point of truth and holding to it. And so in his actual attempt to hold to what he saw as true, what he saw as right and valuable, he was attacked by several different sides. All kinds of sides were attacking the Marquis de Lafayette, this American hero in France. And so like the people on the right, the Republicans, were lambasting him for basically being perceived as someone who didn't support freedom of the press because he opposed a lot of the things that were being said in the press. And then the people of the monarchy were kind of denouncing him as a rabble-rouser who was supporting the people's rights in the people's area. So he was attacked on both of those sides. And then people in the middle were often buying into the attacks and the lies about him having an affair with the despised Queen Marie Antoinette, and if they couldn't prove the affair portions, they would at least try to connect him to Antoinette for all the hated rhetoric about her. And so there are all these different things going on. So Lafayette was not very popular in France at this moment. He was very popular as an American hero, but his emphasis on the American cause was almost so powerful that the French didn't necessarily this wasn't universal, but a lot of the French didn't see him as a French hero. They saw him as an American in French clothing.
Mm-hmm. Poor Lafayette.
So while we are talking about Marie Antoinette, Devon, you brought up some interesting points about "let them eat cake" earlier. That famous phrase coming up this time.
Yeah, the crushing reality of that whole debacle. Thanks to that book, Child of Terror, the book spends about the first half dealing with the reality of Louis and Marie and their courtship, marriage, reign. And it's such a fascinating, she goes down in history as being the one who said, let them eat cake, which is characterized as a super out of touch, really hateful comment about the poor who are literally starving. Right. But I was saying, it's like the soundbite heard around the world. It's so incredibly not what she meant. It's not, she didn't say it to be out of touch. She said it in a genuine level of concern about her people because she was very devoted to them and very committed to them and had been purposefully misfed information or sheltered from right information about the bread shortage, which there was a manufactured shortage of bread flour and there was more cake flour, which thanks to my chef husband, I found out cake flour has less protein. So that's at one point the bakers come to her and explain, we don't have any bread flour left. We have cake flour. Marie Antoinette, who is super concerned with, as Vinton was telling me, particularly young mothers, young families. She was very, very committed to her people and wanted them to live and eat. And she just didn't fundamentally know a lot of the facts. And the response to let them eat cake is, it was feed them whatever you possibly can. Mm-hmm. It definitely wasn't I have cake, you don't. They should. It just wasn't the dramatically out of touch statement that it went down in history as. It was much more of if cake is all we have, then let's feed everybody cake because we don't want people starving. So
that book, Child of Terror, does a really great job of emphasizing Marie Antoinette's character and how much she is absolutely committed to the French people, even though they're not her native-born people. Mm-hmm. She is very committed to families. She originally, said that we're going to give some money to any family that will nurse their own kids and be able to support that because we want to invest in it. She was very much involved in the political thinkings of Rousseau and some of the political philosophers of her day. But because she was so involved in that and so sheltered from everything else, they saw her as someone that was philosophically in touch, but you don't care about philosophy if you can't have food on your table. So they, like, people were looking at her as out of touch. And so whenever they got that soundbite, they're like, yes, this is the thing to prove it. This is the thing to show that she is so out of touch that we can't trust her. We can't support her. She's just nobility. We need to say off with her head.
Yeah. And it's tragic because she was, like you said, she was incredibly devoted to her people, even though they weren't her people. I mean, she came to the court when she was 12. Is that?
Yeah, as an Austrian princess or whatever.
I mean, and she really took great strides to be informed. And that was very difficult for them because they were absolute monarchs. They were isolated. They were held up as figureheads. They were not meant to get into the nitty-gritty of everyday governance. They were... And so there were a lot of things working against her, mostly being foreign, being the queen, and then you have that tragic soundbite that is, that was just the fire the press needed to.
Right. You hear that all the time in modern politics where someone just says one thing off the cuff and that ends their entire political campaign because that's the thing they keep airing over and over and over again in the 24-hour news cycle. And that's what happened to Marie Antoinette, the wife of King Louis XVI. And so if you're interested in getting into what's happening in King Louis XVI's life on that side of the ocean in regard to, like, this musical talks a little bit about him as the king whose head is now in a basket. But if you want to know what led to that a little bit more, that Child of Terror book is really a really good one. I am so excited to finish reading that because it's so much fun.
One of the interesting things that I was reading about is that it was his leadership that kind of funded or, inspired the guillotine to be made in the first place.
Yes.
And then he was, of course, that's how he would die.
Totally. Yeah. They're super excited about this new invention. They come, show it to the king. It's
nice
humane.
way to die. And the king's like, yes, I support this.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, we support you dying in it.
Yeah.
You
Totally.
ought to give it a try.
Tragic.
Nice callback. So coming right back to the lyrics, Washington does mention to Hamilton, draft a statement of neutrality, and Hamilton will in history. And it was a very short one known as the Proclamation of Neutrality. Mm-hmm. And Hamilton and Madison actually are going to fight about this in history in pamphlets written under pseudonyms. And Madison himself didn't really want to do that, but Jefferson was like, no, you gotta do that.
Yeah, Jefferson's kind of the pusher.
I thought that was hilarious when I discovered that little factoid. I love these pithy little, like... email battles, essentially, it's like they put it out on the net, and just come at me, bro, and it's hilarious.
Of the day.
It totally is. Yeah, it's like
or Twitter of the day, I guess I should say now.
They would have been subtweeting each other left and right.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's hilarious.
Yeah. So one of the biggest fallbacks, obviously, we were talking about from this cabinet meeting is that there is that statement of neutrality. We call it the Proclamation of Neutrality, and that's what it's called in history. The word neutrality didn't actually appear in the text because as almost a open hand to Jefferson, who was so opposed to the word neutrality because he thought that would kind of spark animosity between the French people and the American people. So as a little bit of an olive branch to Jefferson's side and the Republican side, the statement itself said that they pledged us to a conduct friendly and impartial, which basically meant that we weren't going to give them guns, we weren't going to give them support as this. So it meant that we are neutral, but Jefferson didn't want to use that word. So
friendly and impartial.
Right.
You mean neutral? No,
not neutral. Not just exactly the definition of neutral.
Right. Just you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. Yeah.
So we already jumped into it and discussed this, but Jefferson and did you forget Lafayette? And so they kind of go over that. We already kind of talked about that. Hamilton says, Lafayette's a smart man. He'll be fine. Being smart doesn't necessarily mean you're going to survive something like this. Yeah. But if you mean by he'll be fine that he's going to survive, yeah, I guess he'll be fine.
He'll be emaciated and worn out and weak, and his family will be dead.
But he'll be fine.
I mean, he'll make it.
A lot of other people won't.
Right. And Hamilton is, it seems to me that he's very aware of the way that it's going. And Jefferson, like we said, has that romantic ideal of what is going on versus the reality. And I think Hamilton is not blind to that, but knows that we just cannot afford to get into this fight.
Right.
And then also that this fight is nuts. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we've talked about how Jefferson and Hamilton kind of framed the American conversation for generations to come. And we've seen in our own lifetimes wars that are supported with this exact back and forth, saying if we try to fight in every revolution in the world and we never stop, where do we draw the line? Like, if we are trying to police the world, even if it's for democracy's sake and spreading freedom, if we try to do that for everyone in the world, we will exhaust our own resources. We cannot do that. And then the Jeffersonian side fights back and says, but shouldn't we be supporting freedom? Shouldn't we be on the side of independence and liberty and fighting for the people and the masses? And so there's that back and forth that we see repeated throughout all of American history. Mm-hmm. And Jefferson, as those terms are drawn, he shoots back to Hamilton and says, "You're so quick-witted, Hamilton. Alas, I admit it," which of course he would, because he's Hamilton. He'll take it as a compliment. And he talks about his law practice, saying, "Bet you were quite a lawyer." And Hamilton just acknowledges, because he loves getting the praise, "My defendants got acquitted." Mm-hmm. And then the final accusation in this, "Someone ought to remind you that you're nothing without Washington behind you."
Yeah, that line, "My defendants got acquitted," this is a bit of a stretch, but I do think it's interesting, and it might have been interesting if he would have worded it a little bit differently. One of his defendants was the Constitution, so take that, Jefferson.
Oh, yeah, from the first act. That's what we talked about when he was trying to get Burr to defend his... his Constitution.
Also, I just thought of this when we were discussing it just now, is when he says, if we try to fight in every revolution in the world, we never stop. Where do we draw the line? Reminds me of when he said, "Will the blood we shed begin an endless cycle of vengeance and death with no defendants?"
That's great. Yeah, he's talking about the cycle of death, and he needs to he understood from the very beginning in this musical.
Yeah, my shot.
Yeah, that we don't want to create a cycle of vengeance. Hamilton is not in favor of revolutions just for the sake of revolution. He is in favor of revolution for the sake of order, for the sake of things being organized. That's why he supported and defended a lot of the British loyalists after the war, because he said, we can't just perpetually fight each other. We can't perpetually be opposed to Great Britain. We can't perpetually be involved in angry, aggressive wars. We have to eventually stabilize. We have to get our government under control. We have to get our economy under control. And we have to have a system that is orderly and organized. That's why he defended the Constitution so readily, because he said, this is our system of government. We want to make sure we have that in place. One other thing that is worth bringing up, just kind of in closing, I know we don't have a lot of time to go into it. We could do a whole episode about this if we wanted to. We talked at the very beginning about how one of the issues that they discussed in this historical cabinet meeting was whether or not to accept a ambassador from France and whether or not to acknowledge them. And that one of the other olive branches that Washington allowed is he allowed Jefferson the right to welcome the French ambassador, Citizen Genet, into the United States. And so early on, the Republicans were very much in favor of the Citizen Genet guy. They were applauding him. They were giving him huge receptions, huge welcomings. And as Citizen Genet went across the country, he kind of eventually started making Hamilton's point for him, because he was probably the worst choice that the French could have ever possibly sent over to represent their cause. So he comes over and he's so pompous that when Washington won't meet with him originally, he says, I'm just going to go around Washington's back and I'm just going to appeal directly to the American people. Doesn't matter what Washington does.
Whoa, dude.
And who do you not attack when you're in the Washington administration? Like, the one person who's off limits, the one person you're not supposed to attack is George Washington. Yeah. And Citizen Genet is like, you know what, I don't care about Washington. I'm just going to appeal to the people, and they're going to be in favor of this. And so he goes to that. At one point when Washington says, like, after this statement of neutrality is promoted, Citizen Genet is in American harbors outfitting private American ships to be privateers pirating against the British ships. So he's trying to outfit private Americans to attack the British because the government won't do that themselves. And so Washington's like, no. You can't go commission American ships to fight in your war when we've just said we're not going to take sides. Right. And so here Citizen Genet is going off and he's like, I don't care about that. I'm just going to outfit Americans to do this thing. And so Jefferson, who is very much pro-France, he was trying to help Citizen Genet the whole time. And Citizen Genet is just like, he doesn't care. He is so aggressively independent about his own ideals and what he's doing that he eventually even the Republican side turns against Genet, and eventually is like, oh, okay, we just have to admit that this guy was bad for the relationship. They tried to get him sent back to France, and eventually it becomes so heated that it looks like in the French Revolution, even someone as French as Citizen Genet would have been killed and murdered in the streets when he went back to France, because that's the thing to do to French representatives at that time, to cut their heads off. And so when Hamilton is talking about this with Washington, he says, hey, look, I know we don't like Citizen Genet, but you can't send him back to France because he will be murdered, and that blood will be on your hands, and Jefferson and his troops will use that as ammunition against the Federalists. So we need to at least protect Citizen Genet's life, even though we don't like him being here.
Right.
So Citizen Genet is granted basically some asylum in America. He applies for American citizenship, and as the French ambassador comes back and ironically finishes his days as an American, and he gets married into the Clintonian family that Governor Clinton in New York offers a marriage with his daughter, and so Citizen Genet marries into one of the rival families to Hamilton in New York politics, and so he spends his days as a New York farmer, and it's a really interesting thing. One of my favorite chapters in the Ron Chernow biography is called Citizen Genet in chapter 23. If you're interested in getting more of that information, just flip to that chapter. It is really interesting. You'll get into the French relationship. You'll get into some of the debates back and forth about Jefferson and Hamilton, what they were really saying. I highly recommend it. All that to be said, Cabinet Battle number 2 had a lot of things on the table, a lot of context around it. It was huge. It was important. Lots of complex situations being debated, lots of complex ideas being thrown around. This is a really, really fun debate.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then
amazing.
in the future, when we get done with this musical, we might be having some more episodes, continuing it a little further, and diving deeper into some of these subjects. And we might actually have Devon back on to talk more about this subject specifically.
Yes. We're talking about having some What Comes Next episodes.
Right.
Yeah.
After the musical itself is resolved, we're going to talk about, okay, what comes next for this guy named Marquis de Lafayette? What comes next for this other character in the cast, and what happens after the musical in our characters' lives? And so definitely stay tuned for that. I'm excited for what might come next.
And I would be delighted. That would be, because these two events are so inextricably linked. You have one and you have the other immediately following, but they're key to, like, as we were saying, they're tipping points in world history.
And there's a lot of misinformation out there where people think that the French Revolution inspired the American Revolution, when the opposite is true. I mean, the French had been involved in revolts for a while. Like, there was going to be an uprising eventually.
Yes.
But Paris was almost more pro-American Revolution than New York was. Like, New York had more people opposed to the American Revolution than Paris did, because they were so invested in the American cause and the American dream. So, the American Revolution is part of what fueled and fired the French Revolution, and eventually Napoleon's rise and his claim to power. And you'll see what happened between Jefferson. Like, I hope that in those future episodes we can talk about what happened between Jefferson and Napoleon's relationship, because by the time Jefferson's president, you see that whole dynamic involved. And it
dive into the Louisiana Purchase a little bit.
Yes, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's going to be fun. Thanks so much, Devon, for joining us. I've learned a lot from you.
Yeah.
It was my pleasure. I learned so much from you both. I'm going to now have to go check out like 5 or 6 more books from the library, it looks like, and get on my game for the other half of the story. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, so next week we're going to be covering Washington on Your Side, as this song kind of ends with, "You're nothing without Washington behind you. Daddy's calling."
Yes.
So it kind of leads into that. So that's where we're going to be going next week.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.
If you'd like to get into contact with us, you can always email us at contact@graphocast.com. You can actually leave comments on these episode posts on our website, graphocast.com. Check us out on Twitter, @graphocast. I'm @FleshEater.
I'm @Alpha Knight.
And Devon?
I'm at WUVA. That's Whiskey Unicorn Victor Victor Alpha.
That's awesome. If our listeners want to hear more of you, Devon, how can they hear you?
You can go to okiegeek.com, and we have all of our episodes on our website. So just check us out over there.
For those not from Oklahoma, Okie, O-K-I-E.
Right? Yeah, I should have prefaced that. Yeah.
Just making sure.
All of you who aren't Oklahomies.
So until next time, I'm Vinton Bayne.
I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
And I'm Devon Green.
Scene.
Hi, Vinton Bayne here again for a real quick announcement. The Graphomania Podcast Network has a new podcast, Read Brave Comics, a comics podcast where your hosts, Corey Casto and I, will introduce you to a wide variety of segments about the world of comic books, some of which will include segments by me and Robbie from this very Hamilton podcast. Check it out now on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, or at graphocast.com, graphocast.com. That's Read Brave Comics.